Hi, my name is Toàn, and I'm in charge of handling Section 9, Univariate Recurrent Analysis. And in this section, I will introduce you guys Univariate Recurrent Analysis, or short for URA. So URA is a statistical framework designed to evaluate how strong and meaningful a difference between two system states really is. So in many scientific fields, such as climate science, economics, and large-scale data analysis, researchers often compare two conditions. For example, a control state and an experimental or disturbed state. Traditional statistical tests can tell us whether a difference exists, but they do not always tell us whether the difference is strong enough to be meaningful in practice. So this is exactly where URA becomes useful. It provides a way to evaluate the practical strength and robustness of a signal rather than only its statistical significance. So in the following slides, I will explain the motivation behind URA, the core idea, its purpose and applications, and how it helps researchers to interpret statistical results more reliably. So in the next slide, first, let's look at the motivation behind URA. Traditional hypothesis tests, such as student t-tests, are commonly used to determine whether the difference exists between two groups. However, the tests have a methodological paradox. When we analyze very large datasets, as the sample size increases, the statistical power of the test approaches 1. This means that even very small differences between two groups can become statistically significant. The problem is that statistical significance does not always mean practical importance. For example, if we look at the graph on the right side of the slide, we can see the relationships between signal strength and sample size. As the sample size becomes larger, the minimum signal needed to detect a difference becomes smaller. So with a very large dataset, we may detect differences that are statistically significant, but actually very weak in practice. And because of this issue, so researchers propose univariate recurrence analysis. The core idea of URA is to change the research pattern. Instead of asking the traditional question, does the difference exist? URA asks the more meaningful questions. Is the difference strong enough to be meaningful and reproducible? In other words, URA shifts focus from simply detecting a difference to evaluate the practical significance and the stability of that difference. So this idea is illustrated in the Venn diagram on the right side of the slide. The left circle, or the green circle, represents statistical significance, which answers the questions: is the result real? And is usually based on probability measures like p-values. And the right circle, or the yellow circle, represents practical significance, which asks, does the result actually matter? And focuses on the magnitude and real-world impact of the effect. The intersection between the two represents insight, meaning results are both statistically valid and practically meaningful. Based on this idea, URA has several important purposes. First, as shown in the box on the left, URA helps establish a normality standard for signal intensity, meaning it provides a reference level to determine whether a signal is strong enough to be meaningful. Second, it helps researchers identify differences that are stable and practical meaningful, rather than differences that appear only due to statistical artifacts. And third, URA helps reduce misleading conclusions caused by extremely large sample size. If you look at the figure on the right side, they further illustrate this concept. The top diagram shows how two statistical decision thresholds separate true signals from noise, but weak signals still appear significant depending on the threshold. The bottom graph shows the relationship between sample size and effect size. As the sample size increases, the minimum detectable effect becomes smaller, which again explains why large datasets can detect very small effects. Finally, the last figure summarizes the relationship between effect size and p-values. There are four possible situations, okay? For example, when the effect size is small but the p-value is significant, the result may be statistically significant but not practically meaningful. If the both effect size is large and the p-value is significant, the, this is the ideal situation where the result is both statistically and practically meaningful. There may also be cases where a result is potentially meaningful but underpowered, meaning that we may need more data to confirm it. This framework helps researchers interpret results carefully and avoid misleading conclusions. In summary, URA provides a more robust way to evaluate differences in large datasets. Instead of focusing on statistical significance, URA helps researchers to determine whether a signal is strong, meaningful, and reproducible in real-world systems. So now that we understand the motivation behind the URA, so we can move on to the definition, creepy recurrence, which is the core concept of this method. So the first, the basic idea. In URA, we compare two variables. The first variable is x, represent the control state, meaning the normal or the baseline condition of the system. And the second variable is y, represent the experimental or disturbed state, meaning the system after some change or intervention. The goal is to determine whether the distribution of y shows a meaningful deviation from the distribution of x. So the next we define a threshold, which is shown in the middle section of the slide. We choose a sequential xq from the distribution of x. This sequential acts as a reference level derived from the control state. The threshold specified to probability condition. First, the probability where x is less than xq equal to q. This means that Q represents the probability that values from the control distribution fall below the threshold. Second, the probability where Y is greater than XQ equal to P. This means that P represents the probability that values from experimental distribution exceed the same threshold. So the threshold helps us compare the behavior of the two distributions using probabilities. Now let's move to the interpretation. So in the right section of the slide, the value xq acts as a classification threshold between the two states. The parameter Q represents the probability of the correctly identifying observation from the control state. Meanwhile, P represents the probability of correctly identifying observation from the experimental state. In other words, P measures how well the threshold captures the control distribution, and while P measures how strongly the experimental distribution exceeds that threshold. So that the key idea is summarized at the bottom of the slide. Instead of simply comparing the two distributions directly, so URA converts the comparison into a threshold-based called classification problem. Yes, this makes it easier to evaluate how strongly the experimental state deviates from the control state. So after defining the general concept of pre-P recurrence, we now look at a special and commonly used case called P recurrence. As shown in the formal definition at the top of the slide, P recurrence occurs when the Q equals to 0.5. When Q equals to 0.5, the threshold xq corresponds to the median of the control distribution x. If the distribution is symmetric, this value is also equal to the mean x. Or P recurrence measures the probability that a value from the disturbed state E exceeds the average level of the control state X. Mathematically, this can be expressed as a probability where y is greater than Vx. In simple terms, P recurrence tells us how often the disturbed state produces values higher than the typical levels of the control state. Yes, now look at the bottom left section of the slide. If we assume that the data follow a normal distribution and both groups have equal variance, we can express the difference between the two states using standardized form. Specifically, the difference between the means of y and x can be written as my minus x divided by sigma equal to Gp. This quantity represents the standardized effect size. In other words, this measures how lax the difference between the two means is relative to the variability of the data. Finally, the bottom right section shows how we estimate B from sample data. Since in practice we usually work with samples rather than full distributions, we can replace the population parameter with the sample estimates. The estimated recurrence probability is calculated as P equal to Fn. Here, S bar and E bar are the sample means. Sp is the pool standard deviation, and Fn is the cumulative distribution function of the normal distribution. This formula allows how to estimate the probability that values from the state exceed the control state based on observed data. So overall, P recurrence provides a practical way to measure how strongly the experimental state deviates from the control state, especially when the data follow a normal distribution. In the next part, we will see how this concept can be applied in statistical testing and practical data analysis. And after discussing P recurrence, we now move to an even stricter criterion called PP recurrence. This concept provides a more demanding way to distinguish between the control state and the disturbed state. As shown in the former definition at the top of the slide, PP recurrence is a special case of PP recurrence where both probabilities are equal. Mathematically, it is defined as P is less than XP equal to P probability where Y is greater than XP equal to P. This means that both distributions satisfy the same probability of the P relative to the same threshold XQ. In other words, the threshold divides the two distributions in a balanced way, ensuring that the separation between the control state and the experimental state is stronger. Now let's look at the bottom left section of the slide, which assumes a normal distribution. If both x and e follow a Gaussian distribution have equal variance, the difference between them can again be expressed in the standardized form. But in the PP recurrence, the separation requirement becomes stronger, and the difference between the two means are must satisfy Vx minus Vy minus Vx equal to 2Gp multiplied by sigma. This means that the distance between the two distributions must be twice as large as in the P recurrence case. Finally, let's look at the interpretation. Because the criterion is stricter, PP recurrence requires a large standardized mean difference compared to B recurrence. This ensures a stronger between the distribution of x and y, make it easier to clearly distinguish the control state from the experimental state. In other words, PP recurrence provides a more conservative and reliable criterion for a meaningful difference between the two system states. So after defining P recurrence and PP recurrence, the next question is how we can statistically test whether the observed effects actually satisfy these recurrence conditions. This leads us to a parametric testing for PP recurrence. First, objective. First, let's look at the objective. So at the top of the slide, the goal is to test whether the observed effect is stronger than on predefined recursion level P. For example, in the case of P recurrence, where P equal to 0.5, the null hypothesis states that the standardized difference between the two states is smaller than the threshold ZP. Equivalently, this means that the probability P probability where y is greater than 0.5 is less than required recurrence probability B. So essentially, the hypothesis that checks whether the signal strength exceeds the recurrence threshold defined by the researchers. Now let's look at test statistics. So in the left box, to perform this test, we use these statistics, compare the means of the two samples. Under the known hypothesis, the test statistics follow a non-central t-distribution. The degrees of freedom are calculated as the formula below, where Nx and Ne are the sample size of the control and experimental groups. Now let's move to the middle section, which introduces the non-centrality parameter denoted by delta. This parameter reflects the true underlying effect size relative to the current threshold. For P recurrence, the non-centrality parameter is defined the formula below. For the stricter PP recurrence, the separation requirement is larger, so the parameter becomes delta equal to 2ZB dot dot dot. So this again reflects the idea that PP recurrence requires a stronger separation between the two distributions. So to summarize the main finding of this section 9, the study focuses on connecting statistical significance with practical or physical significance in two sample comparison problems. The core methodological conclusion is that recurrence analysis provides a more way to measure the strength and robustness of a signal compared to the traditional method like t-test. Importantly, it helps to reduce misleading results that often occur when very large sample size make trivial difference appear statistically significant. More specifically, recurrence analysis addresses the methodological paradox of large samples. It introduces a minimum effect size threshold such as Z or 2ZB, meaning that only effects above this level are considered meaningful. As shown in the figure on the right of the slide, the method evaluates the separation between the control and experimental distribution using probability-based benchmark. This provides a standardized way to measure the separability between two states, helping researchers filter out differences that are statistically detectable but practically insignificant. So in section 9.3, this slide evaluates the methodological strength and limitation of recurrence analysis based on four main criteria. First, regarding assumption. Parametric tests usually require independent observation, normal distribution, and equivariances. However, these assumptions are often violated in time series or spatial data, such as climate or economic data. In practice, URA can also use non-parametric parametric approaches like permutation tests to reduce strict distribution requirements. Second, in terms of application conditions, researchers must define the recurrence level, such as P and Q, based on the domain knowledge. This is useful because it forces researchers to identify to justify why detected effects is meaningful, rather than relying on large sample sizes. Third, regarding generality, the method is applicable to sample distribution comparison and focus on the separations between distribution, not only the mean difference. It's particularly useful in areas like climate science, financial risk analysis, and policy evaluation. Finally, there are some risks for sure, and the results may depend on the chosen threshold P and Q, and some more datasets may overestimate recurrence probability. Therefore, the threshold should ideally be defined using real physical or economic constraints rather than chosen arbitrarily. In the last section, 9.4, this slide highlights three key contradictions within the URA, so how they can be addressed. First, there is a tension between mathematical assumption and empirical data. Parametric models assume independent observation and normal distribution, but real-world data, such as climate or economic data, often shows autocorrelation and non-Gaussian distributions. To address the issue, researchers can rely on non-parametric methods, such as permutation testing, to obtain a more reliable known distribution. Second, there is a contradiction between statistical um, results and a practical meaning. Traditional statistical tests may produce very small p-values, suggesting statistical significance, even when the actual effect is weak. Recurrence analysis helps solve the problem by evaluating the signal strength, ensuring that the detected difference is also physically or economically meaningful. Finally, there's the issue of univariate versus multivariate analysis. If URA is applied independently at each location, it may produce full spatial cluster due to spatial correlation. A better solution is to use multivariate recurrent analysis, which considers the uh, full spatial covariance structure. Yes, a better solution is to use MRA. So in summary, these contradictions highlight both the limitation and the adaptability of the URA network in real-world applications.